I think we're going to get started. 10:45. We had a nice long break before this one. I hope you enjoyed it. Did anyone have those bacon donuts? No? Yes? Were they good? Okay, good. I am Emily Freeman. I'm a developer advocate for Kickbox. We are an email verification startup, and I live in the other Rocky Mountain town of Denver. I'm really excited to be here with you all. You can find me on Twitter at editingemily. I used to be a writer, of all things. I want to talk to you a little bit about DevOps. You see, I'm convinced that Humpty Dumpty is actually a story of DevOps gone wrong. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's men and all the king's horses couldn't put Humpty together again. First, who asks a horse to do surgery? Hooves, they can't hold scalpels, right? Inefficient. Second, either all the king's men are inept or they're not communicating. 2 kindergartners with some Elmer's glue could have done the job. You see, Humpty is a deploy. He was fine in staging, but then he shit the bed in production. Now the site's down, and everyone is up in arms, and your boss is threatening everyone's job. IT says the code is broken. The devs say it's obviously a server issue. Meanwhile, Humpty is bleeding out, and your customers are complaining on Twitter, which means that a customer service rep has entered the incident channel to let you know that the site's down. Yeah, thanks. No shit, Tom. I appreciate that. Sound familiar? I think we've all been there, right? A deploy goes awry, and the entire department is up in arms, defending themselves and blaming each other. This is fairly common. In other words, all the king's horses and all the king's men aren't communicating. Now, I'm on the dev side of DevOps, so I'm not going to say who the horses are in this situation. But on most teams, there is a tension. It could be described as a friction, an attitude, or a general inability to tolerate each other without eye rolls and audible sighs. What I like to call good old Southern-style passive aggressiveness. But it doesn't have to be that way. If we're going to solve problems, real-world, critical problems, the kind that get our hearts pumping a little bit faster and make us want to leap out of bed every morning, well, we're going to have to change our attitudes. But change is hard, and it's actually a lot of responsibility. Sometimes I'd like to walk in every Monday morning and just have my boss tell me exactly what to do. I want to sit down with like a nice little to-do list, pointed stories, and then get to work, right? It's much easier for someone else to take all the responsibility and make the final call. It may be the easier path, but I don't think it's the right one. I believe making our jobs awesome is our job. So what's next? Where do we start? I think we have to start by looking back and acknowledging the decisions and processes that got us into this mess to begin with. Like it or not, developers are measured by the number of features they release. No CEO has ever cracked open code to review your thorough test suite or, marveled at the glorious method name you picked out. I mean, I appreciate it. If all of us decided to tackle our growing mound of tech debt this month, instead of working on the latest and greatest feature that the sales team has come up with and probably already sold to a client, you better believe that we would be hauled into someone's office and chided. But operations folks, they're measured on an entirely different aspect of the business: site reliability and uptime. And you better believe that keeping a site up for 99.99% of the time, those 5 nines everyone's talking about, that's no easy feat. I'll spare you the math. That's a little over 5 minutes of downtime per year. 5 minutes. So to break this down, developers must deploy new code and release new features. But deploys are usually the cause of those critical problems that cause that site downtime. So it's really no wonder we're natural enemies. Our different priorities lead us to butt heads, and we quickly devolve into working around each other, mumbling about each other's ineptitude. Which puts us in a vicious cycle, right? Developers get really excited about a new feature, and then they throw it over to ops to deploy and to support. And all the responsibility to keep the site up and customers happy is dumped on operations, which leaves the ops people feeling, let's be honest, sometimes looking a little bit like Grumpy Cat. I think this is fundamentally unfair. I think everyone deserves to feel like this absurdly happy dog. I mean, look at this dog. If I felt like that every time I walked into work in the morning, I'd never leave my job, right? I think we all deserve to feel that kind of passion for our work. And I think I know how we can at least start to get there. I'm going to start with the operations folks. You need to empower your developers. And that really starts with trusting your team. You're on the same side. If a developer says that the code works, they honestly believe that the code works. They could be wrong. We all make mistakes. But they're not trying to make your life a living hell, and they're not trying to lie to you on purpose. They honestly believe what they wrote is correct. Bridge the skills gap. Ben Traynor of Google describes site reliability engineering as what happens when you take a software engineer and ask him or her to design an operations function. I would bet 90% of our miscommunications stem from a lack of knowledge in a particular area. Now, this doesn't mean that the person you're talking to is stupid. None of us are. What it does mean is that they haven't had a chance to work in the tech stack or tooling that you happen to use every day. So teach them. Take 2 hours a week and pair. Sit down with them. Show them all the cool little things you've discovered. Document your configurations. Make it easy for developers to find answers independently. It's absolutely worth the time investment. Give read-only access to all developers. And you may ask yourself, to what? To everything. I'm not saying hand out root access like candy. I get it. But you are not the gatekeeper of information. Unless you love being interrupted every 5 minutes to copy and paste an error message to a developer who's trying to debug something, there's no reason not to do this. They can't harm anything. Developers are writing the code that runs on your systems. It's not a reach to think that they deserve the ability to get feedback on whether or not it works. After all, don't expect developers to jump in and help you when something's on fire if they don't have access to read those logs. Create consistent platforms. This is really important. Pay attention to the parity between your environments. Staging and production should be identical. That means the same allocated resources and the same data. Not data from 3 months ago or 2 years ago, same data. Otherwise, deploying will always be a roll of the dice. Share your source control. Keep the configuration tools you use on GitHub with the rest of your company's code. Code is code, and it'll be much easier for operations and developers to solve problems together if everyone knows how to locate that affected code. Add your devs to the on-call rotation. This is sometimes a little bit controversial, especially for developers who don't want to be woken up at 3 in the morning, but it's pretty important. My friend likes to say, if you build it, you support it. No one likes being woken up in the middle of the night. And if you're tired of stumbling through the dark, trying to go to your machine, your computer, and figure out what the problem is, it's time to share the pain, right? There's no reason developers shouldn't be on rotation. Remember, they can access all your logs now, and your configuration tools are documented, so you're all set up. Simplify your deploys. Pushing code to production should not be a production. Unnecessary steps increase the opportunity for error and decrease the number of people who are capable of deploying. One more thing. Stop preventing developers from deploying their code to other environments like QA and staging. Seriously, if I have to ask permission to deploy my code to anywhere other than dev, you deserve to put out that fire. Developers, don't be assholes. It's just that easy. Cut the attitude. A little empathy goes a long way. You can't avoid talking to your operations team at all costs and then expect them to blindly support your deploys. Which brings me to plan together. If you're thinking about a feature, include operations. Talk about what will change before you write a single line of code. Discuss why this feature is important, who needs to be involved, and what the risks are. And if your team isn't capable of having those conversations, then you haven't thought through the feature well enough. You can't deploy mystery code and then get irritated when operations says they have 100 questions. Involve them from the beginning. Make small changes. Deploy, do it again. If your feature requires you to change 30% of your app's nastiest spaghetti code, break it into smaller features. Deploy those individually. If you're not sure whether a feature is too big or not, apply the same rule you use for method naming, right? If we have to put an and into a function's name, we know that it's doing too much, and some of that logic needs to be abstracted away. Small deploys make it much easier to determine what went wrong in case of a failure. I've seen this over and over and over again. Communicate. You know how you already included operations in your feature planning? Notify the operations team when you deploy too. Whether you use Slack or HipChat or whatever other way of communicating, make sure that all the developers and operations folks share a single way of communicating. If your devs are on Slack and your operations team is on HipChat, that's a fundamental problem. They can't share when something goes wrong and how to fix it. Many companies use an incident channel. I think this is good, but I'd also encourage you to have like a shoot the shit channel, where you actually get to know each other instead of when things are on fire, like figure out when your birthdays are and what your kids' names are. There's a rule in improv that forces participants to say yes and rather than yes but. I want you to try this next time you're in a meeting. It's a really powerful tool. And in improv, it goes something like this. If you are doing a scene and someone says, I want to buy a blue car, you wouldn't say, well, I don't have any blue cars. Yeah, that's great, but I only have red cars. No, you'd say, oh, I have five blue cars. Which one would you like? And it keeps the conversation moving. It doesn't shut something down. The simple language change will make everyone feel heard, validated, and part of the team. It's a really powerful tool. Be open to other options. If someone in operations says there's going to be a problem, assume there's going to be a problem. That means shutting your mouth and really hearing what they have to say. Developers are just that, engineers. You're not God. The core competency of operations is site reliability, right? So let them help you. The solution you come to together will be a much better one than the one you thought of on your own. Have some humility. If someone was woken up in the middle of the night because of something you released, say sorry. Buy them some coffee. They're tired now. Having some ownership over what you deploy and being willing to take accountability for that, that'll help them out. Own what you build. When you take that responsibility, your colleagues will be much less likely to build a little voodoo doll and keep it under their bed for these little events. Failure is never a question of if, but when. You will fail, and that's okay. A deploy will bring down the site. I mean, who here has brought down the site? Oh, you're all liars. There you go. A typo in your configuration will bring users to Twitter fisticuffs. It happens. We're human. We make mistakes. And until Skynet takes over the world, we're all stuck dealing with those occasional errors. So have a healthy attitude around your failure. I recommend applying the 80-20 rule to your failure preparedness. It's okay to spend 80% of your time trying to prevent failure. But I challenge you to devote like 20% of your time to practicing what to do when you do fail. I flew here from Madison yesterday, and I can tell you that when I get on a plane, put my headphones in, and I mostly ignore the flight attendants doing their little safety dance. But I feel very strongly that I appreciate that someone has thought of that. That when the plane is depressurized, oxygen falls from the ceiling, and all I have to do is put it on my face. It's important, right? Leave your egos at the door. I am a competitive powerlifter. I know I don't look like that. I'm not big and bulky, but I do. And when I started powerlifting seriously several years ago, I joined a really small team of extremely intimidating lifters. They're like monsters of men. Really nice people, but wouldn't want to be in an elevator with them. The head of the group was a 60-year-old juggernaut. His traps rose to basically his ears. He had no neck. And he just had one rule, that I had to leave my ego at the door. It didn't matter that we had to strip off 400 pounds every time it was my turn to squat. All that mattered was that I listened, I learned, and I respected the team. I think we can all learn a lot from that. Stop pointing fingers. It never feels good to make a mistake. And when 20 people are required to rectify that, it feels even worse, right? When I screw up, I feel embarrassed. I care about the work that I do. I want to be a great developer. So of course I'm embarrassed. But when I feel attacked, I become defensive. And I think most people in this room would feel the same way. So let's give everyone a little bit of slack. It could have been your mistake, your typo. Post-incident reviews, they used to be called postmortems. They're not optional. Don't leave it up to that one enthusiastic junior on your team to throw a flag in play every time something goes wrong. I want you to make this process part of your workflow. When something goes wrong, sit down, discuss it. Hold a post-incident review within 48 hours. It's just that simple. There are 8 questions I like to focus on during those. What happened? What was impacted? Who was involved? How was it discovered? These things are important. It can help you rectify the root cause of the issue, but I want you to remember that there's not always a single site or single point of failure. Sometimes it's many factors that led into it. If someone in your organization, it's usually a VP of product or something, is constantly going on and on about who needs to be fired every time something goes wrong, then the answer is always your boss. It's his or her job to be a shit umbrella for all of that. And if they're not willing to be that, it may be time to find a new boss. Responsibility is always distributed amongst the entire team. Blame should be shared. Failure should be celebrated because it's how we learn. And I challenge you, next time you fail, publicize it. Share it with your team. When people I respect tell me that they've made mistakes, it gives me permission to push the envelope, to take risks, to try, even if it means that I will eventually fall on my face. It's even more important if you're a senior or principal engineer on your team. Remember, making your job awesome is your job. It's up to all of us. And I hope I've shared a few ways that I think we can improve our teams. Thank you so much. I'd love to take questions, but I also think we have time. And I think it would be really useful in this type of environment to share what your experiences have been, what has worked, what has not worked, your sort of core stories, and we can kind of keep that confidential within this room if you're comfortable. Does anyone have any comments or questions? Yeah.
I think my hospital is back on the program.
I'm with you.
What's the only big challenge of when your ops to developer ratio is 10 to 1? We have like 40 developers and like 3 ops.
Yeah.
They're overloaded.
Yeah.
And so we can overload them easily. So any thoughts or advice on like making sure that of us not being able to like not take their life work, even when they're already strapped as they are already.
Yeah, I think that's important. I see that a lot, like that ratio. I would say like, I mean, maybe someone else has other opinions. I think like a 4-to-1 ratio is like more acceptable. So hire some more ops people if you have any influence over that. But then the other thing was to teach your developers how to do some of this work, creating little run books and teaching them how to handle like the simple stuff, even if that means they're the primary responder, and if it goes over their head, they call someone. But just having that responsibility, I think, is really healthy for the team. It will also make sure that they, write better code. Like if I'm waking up in the middle of the night because I forgot to write a try-catch statement, I'm going to be a little bit more cautious. And then 2, I think making sure that your operations team is not exhausted. So if someone in operations was woken up in the middle of the night, then they deserve time off later to make up for that. I'm really big on them not working more than 40 hours a week unless something is really on fire, like really on fire. It's just not humane, and people are going to eventually quit. Someone working around the clock doesn't make them a good employee. It makes them a former employee, I think. And if you want to retain your team and that institutional knowledge you have, I think it's really important to treat them well. I hope that helps. Okay. Yeah.
I'd like to hear the story about how you got the role of developer advocate.
Okay, that's valid. So developer advocacy is a new role. Who's heard of that? Okay. So usually it's split into like 2 types, and companies have a lot of different approaches to it. You have evangelists who do a lot more of this, where you're going around and like talking to people and just you usually work for some kind of vendor. And it's not just like a sales pitch, because that's gross, but mostly like, okay, well, if you have this problem, here's how you do it. And then advocacy is more of a split role, I think. At least that's my interpretation of it. So for me personally, fall and spring are heavy conference seasons. So I come around and I give talks and I get to meet people and figure out what their problems are. And that helps me go back to product to make sure that our product at Kickbox is good, that the features that people need are there, and that the things that they don't like get, retired. And then I also write SDKs and things and technical blogs to get people on our API and using our product. Yeah, things like that. Does that answer your question? Good? Yeah.
There's a big divide between dev and ops, and I think there's a big divide between dev and ops, and I think that's a great mistake. There's an assumption that operations can't figure out how to code, and that programmers don't know how to op.
Yeah.
Operations is very much an engineering problem.
Yes.
It is something that we should solve with engineering resources. I work for LinkedIn. One of the things that we've been doing lately is we've been doing developer exchanges. So we take one of our SREs and we jump them over to development. We take a development engineer, we push them over to SRE. Sometimes it's only for a couple of weeks, sometimes it's for a couple of months, but it's been really helpful to kind of break down those barriers of dev versus ops and more dev with ops. So anybody who's trying to figure out how to do that, I strongly recommend it. I also think that we need to stop being firefighters. That is not a thing that we should be focusing on. We should be focusing on how to do fire mitigation or fire prevention.
Yeah.
That's why chaos engineering is so very common now, is we're realizing that fires are inevitable. So how do we contain the blast radius? How do we reduce that? And how do we be effective and communicate what the design patterns that don't work and the design patterns that do work?
I love that. I love that you're shading teams. Can you share a little bit more about chaos engineering in case someone isn't familiar with it?
Sure. So with the assumption that fires happen, we go in production when we intentionally cause fires. That sounds pretty scary, but it's really, really valuable. There are lots of mechanisms and methods that you can use to kind of mitigate the external exposure while still gathering important data. The best one is AWS and Amazon. They have their chaos monkeys, which go around and randomly shut off nodes. For anybody who has a persistent data store, that scares the hell out of them. How about you shard that persistent data store in a meaningful way? But it really exposes in your infrastructure how things work when stuff fails. I recently attended a talk where they said that the 4 main criteria for failure were your routing, your application, blah, blah, blah. But one of the really big ones was that your humans are a huge part of your chaos. And it's not that the humans cause chaos, it's that when chaos happens, the humans don't know how to respond, much to your flight attendant comment. So chaos engineering allows us to build processes and systems around when failure happens, what do we do? And as we practice that chaos and we regularly shoot nodes in the head in production, what that looks like. How does our alerting go off? Does that happen correctly? Is the diagnostic tools there to quickly identify the issue? How do we allocate the resources correctly to build tools to do this kind of stuff? Yeah, so chaos engineering is screwing with stuff in production.
Absolutely. I think a sort of step into that is to do like feature flags and stuff. And so you're like chaos engineering a portion. So you're not trying to tell people like, oh, we're just going to shut down the site for a little bit and see what happens, you know. The other thing I'd say I'd add to the chaos engineering is it's really important, you touched on it, doing this with people as well. So I want you to take your most senior engineer's laptop, confiscate it, and send him on a vacation for 5 days and see what happens. I have worked so many places where the person that has been there for 5 to 10 years knows everything, and that kind of institutional knowledge is really difficult to pass on. I don't like the hit by the bus theory, but like let's approach it like that. If they quit tomorrow, you have a problem. And so practicing and making sure that everyone on your team knows what they need to do in that kind of situation, so your senior engineers can like go on vacations, that would be good. I think, yeah, and then I'll come back to you. Can you, so you have clients who have ops teams but no developers? Interesting. Yeah. That's really interesting. I'd love to hear if someone has do you have a response to that? This man needs a mic.
So in a past life, I was a managed service provider, and we had the exact same problem. And part of that has to be that the development of the enterprise application has to be comfortable letting the operations people into your code. So yes, they don't have an engineering background, but you can say, this is how we do this thing. This is the kind of functions that we're using to mangle your data. And allowing them to understand fundamentally how your system works internally will increase their ability to better troubleshoot and rectify the problem. So it's not quite the same thing as exposing all of your inner secrets, but it is identifying why they can't be effective and closing that gap through education and conferences like this.
Did you have something else to add to that?
Yeah, back up.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you on a larger scope, how you feel about the idea of taking a step back from blurring the dichotomy of dev and ops and blurring the dichotomy of management and tech. Because if you go back to the beginning of your slideshow, you're talking about how management doesn't fund quality and development features for quality. They don't measure quality until they get ops. So they define all of these with roles and responsibilities that are air gaps between.
Yeah.
And so now you find yourself in a position of having to manage from the bottom.
Yes.
And now you have to take on some management responsibility. What about creating that management take more interested in technology?
And I think this is where we really have to push back. I think I've worked for places where certain managers really like there to be accountability, and by that they mean like a head to roll when something goes wrong. And so having those like very clearly defined teams, like this person's development and this person's in ops, they don't do so well when we're like, oh, we're all going to do this together. And when something goes wrong, it's like it's a process problem, not a human problem.
The game they're playing is they're trying to like define all the responsibilities so they're not part of it. So their skin is not in the game when something goes wrong.
Perhaps.
And allow either dev or ops allowing a project that assumes that kind of like structure. We should put it back to that.
Yeah, so I think first it's assuming that like they are doing this with best intentions. I think if you approach your management and you're like angry and assuming that they're doing things deviously, that's not a healthy environment for anyone to work in. So assume that they're trying to do their best job just like you would any colleague. But definitely, I think it's our job to push back. And when something goes wrong, and this is what I mean about your boss being a shit umbrella, like they are at that executive level. They should know and be educated on this type of thing and how we're handling these problems now and how we're solving and approaching this, and be able to say like, no, it's not one person's problem. Equifax was the best example of this recently. You know, they tried to say that one person was in charge of that. Like, come on, really? You really think that's true? No. And so you have to like push back and say this is shared responsibility. We're improving our processes. This is what we've discovered through our post-incident review, and have those kind of difficult but stern conversations. That makes sense.
Yeah.
You had a question earlier. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. So just to repeat, she had an issue, and correct me if I'm wrong, you had a developer, something went wrong, and then it wasn't written down anywhere. So it's like, well, how do I find this? Where is it documented? And it's like, well, we'll just handle it. No one on any team is a gatekeeper of information. And this behooves you personally, right? Like if you feel like you need to hold on to information for job security, like wrong. One of the most successful people, mentors I have spoken to in my life, the first thing he does when he gets a new job is he trains the person right under him how to do everything in his job. And the process is, one, it's great for the team because you have shared responsibility, and two, if someone wants to promote him, there's zero reason to keep him there. I think we all know a developer who's just like a little too good at their job and ends up losing opportunities because management's like, no, you're so good here. I don't want to move you. That's risky, you know? And so I definitely think like don't be a gatekeeper yourself and encourage other people to not be a gatekeeper. Part of this is a management issue, and just making sure that people do write things down and making that part of, I think, how you evaluate an employee. You know, it's not just, are you great at coding? Are you great at operations, standing up servers or whatever? Can you work with your team, you know? Being communicative is part of being a good developer, and I think we need to embrace that a little bit more, and that includes writing things down in a shared place, okay? Not Word documents, not someone has a Google Drive issue, not someone has Confluence, like a shared place, everything goes. Yeah.
So I'll share, I work with a Pluralsight,
Mm-hmm.
and we have a DevOps strategy that's a little different. I know that a lot of people like to make fun of the role of the DevOps engineer when that's exactly.
Yeah.
But we've actually defined it as a person that is actually a member of a product team alongside dev.
I love that.
And they are.
Yeah. Did everyone hear that? Pluralsight has they've defined a DevOps engineer as someone who was on a team alongside developers. Yeah.
Like a UI expert on a team might
Yeah.
focus on UI expertise, but the team's responsible for UI. A DevOps engineer brings operation expertise and oftentimes is the developer. So we found a lot of success in that strategy. Of course, we do have our DevOps engineers also a part of a central ops team, so that we can define what operational excellence is.
Yeah.
But then that gets spread out through the project.
I love that. I think that's brilliant. Do that. Yeah.
So I think some of what we're dancing around here is that in IT stuff, there's an awful lot of process improvements to do.
Yes.
But it stems from culture.
Yes.
And so what we're talking about is inherently a cultural issue.
Yes.
If you end up with a management team that does not value stability and values a feature set because that's what sales team is incentivized, none of us can fix that.
Absolutely.
No one who has a technology function can change that. So the only real tool that you have available to yourself at that point is to describe, communicate, to attempt to discuss the problems as you see them, to try to get your project managers and so on board with, well, we don't just care about feature set, we also care about cloud stability and whatever that entails as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the only other feature you really have is to, at some point, let it fail. As we've been discussing, failure is occasionally going to happen anyway.
Yes.
If we have terrible processes which are encouraging or keeping failure likely, then at some point you can say, everybody, the way we're architected right now, this thing's going to fail, it's not going to be great, and then don't go through Herculean efforts and let the thing fail.
Yeah.
Keep your engineers working 40 hours a week because that's what you're paying them for, and don't encourage people to pull in crazy overtime constantly and constantly firefight. At some point, you want to step back and let it fail, and only once the companies experience pain, then it becomes a management issue, like you're capable of rectifying it, because everyone now recognizes it as an issue.
I totally agree. And I think I'll just add on to that there needs to be an honest conversation about where the company is, because if you're a startup and you have nothing to lose, then like site reliability is not that important. Like your feature set is what's more important, so that should be prioritized. If you're Facebook and the site goes down, that's a big fucking problem. And so just being honest about where you are as a company and how, like, the priorities. And if someone says all the things are the priorities, they're just not a good manager, in my opinion. Yes?
The idea of just letting it fail first kind of thing that can actually reflect on what happened and why it happened. There are far too many managers who close and who get lost control.
Ooh.
Moment for you and the reality should be something else because it's not close. That is not an occasional thing in my experience.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair, and I think that it is a cultural issue, and if we don't push at some point, the culture is never going to change, right? And so we're lucky enough that tech is really strong right now, and most of us in this room could go and within 2 weeks have another job. So like, be brave enough and confident enough in your own ability that you're not sticking around in a really bad situation. Like, that's not good for you, you know? Does anyone else have anything to add to that? Other question? Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when I say comment, I said, like, hey, you know what? When I ask for information, I say that you guys. It comes from the domain description. The problems that I keep dealing with, slightly different actually, they're very much different from the old because there's so many combinations of things that can go wrong from storage that goes back to the that even I need to do. They can have nothing, maybe potential problems.
Yeah.
So that's where the domain comes in. And when someone asks what 18 and 22 document about whatever problem, usually I know we experience all the time. You know what? Let's I'm going to do the search. I'm going to find look at all the reasons that can cause it and find practices that actually because I don't have documentation.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas on the developer side, it's a little more structured. Right? And from perspective of the writer code, you have an action code for you for more resources, more searching and sort of only problems. And somehow augment some of the problems.
Mm-hmm.
Not everything, but some of the problems.
Okay.
I think when people are looking at partnerships from DevOps or within IT,
Yeah.
it is important for everyone to understand the work.
Yes, and show empathy for that. And I think what happens on both sides, right? Because I've talked to IT folks and like they've been told that if they don't learn Java, they don't have a job, and I think that's absurd, right? Like if you don't, it doesn't mean that you're less valuable if you're not an app engineer. Like that's okay. From the engineering side, I can say personally, I've spoken to some like sysadmins, IT, and I'm made to feel stupid. Now, like part of that is on me, you know, and being sensitive to that. But I think we can all like show a little more empathy and recognize that everyone in this industry is pretty darn smart. And again, what I was going back to, like you just haven't used those tools. And so going back, there's nothing wrong with having domain knowledge, right? And going back and solving, like especially, you know, as a developer, you gotta like go down and figure out what's actually going on. Take your time to do that, but then loop back and say, okay, I figured it out. On a very high level, this is what happened. This is where you can find your documentation now. Next time that happens, it'll be much easier to solve. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. By who? So like executive product, like the developers. Okay. Yeah, that's tough. I think, one, let's start with our own domain and like work it out between our own little teams. And I think once we can master that, then we can like apply. It also has a magnifying effect in that if you make your devs really empathetic to what you do every day, then you've now created evangelists for your role in other areas of the conversation or other areas of the company whenever they have those conversations. Having really strong management is important. But ultimately, if your company doesn't value your role or your section of the business, like you may want to consider leaving at some point. Like it's just, you can make change, but change is slow, and you have to evaluate like what the cost is to you personally, I think. Is that fair? Go on.
One thought I had is, and I've experienced this, is that if the only interaction I have with a person or a group becomes problems,
Yeah.
that it's always really hard to have a good relationship. And so if I have, people I'm only talking to them when there's problems, I think, okay, how can I go out of my way and have other radio conversations with them when it's not like the site's down, I'm super mad. And that way, when that way you can build a little bit of a relationship with them. So when there's a problem, it's just not this initial, adversarial from the very beginning.
Absolutely. I also think if you find someone in like a split role, like I think I play a role like this in my company where I understand the tech side of it, but I'm also work closely with product, and so like I can bridge that gap a little bit, find someone like that. And also, I like to think, it's not always true, but often when you're in a situation, you have one person who's a strong advocate and one person who's a strong detractor, and figure out who those people are, and then figure out why they're that. And you figure out the why, it's a lot more important, or it enables you to have those kind of difficult conversations and how to improve. You, and then I think we might call it.
I haven't answered my question. If you need to bring people like that, you need to build fraternity. Nothing builds fraternity like giving a lot to people, like shared conversation. So you need to have IT and marketing people participate in a project, issue accountability as peers. Those people, when they slog through the mud and they come out the other end of it, will share some common bond, will develop trust, and they'll have relationships that last. It's good to have joint projects before you have a big one. To develop those relationships between teams before you have like a high risk deliverable.
I like it. Over here in that last one.
So, coming back to your challenge slide, operations is often, or IT in general is often thought as a cost center, unless your product is what IT generates. I work for a big bank. I'm cost center. I'm spending money.
Interesting.
You need to turn that around into, they came up and said, hey, your 5,000 service, you add another 1,000 to it, and we don't add any people to it. That's a success story. I just took 15 people, managed 5,000, and made 6,000, and I'm not spending I spent money on hardware, but on the flip side, I didn't do all this. You need to look at how are you saving the company money in doing what you're doing. If you come up and say, here we are, Salt, I'm looking at it, deploy Salt, get X amount of carbon, people support the doing garbage trash. Those types of successes can help sell what you are doing and make you look, instead of as a cost center, as a value added, contributing to the overall bottom dollar of the company, which you're trading on public market, stock market, that's contributing to that. Also, I hate doing these, but we have a management report that we do every month. In there, we list all our successes.
I like that.
Start generating one of those and set it up and say, this new thing came out, it knocked the entire market down, and we had it back up in 5 minutes.
Yep.
That's a success. Highlight your successes. And if you're having a challenge with gee whiz, they've added a whole bunch of new products, and we've been asking the servers to run it on, and our servers are hitting capacity. Need some help here, but no line item in there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. One more plug before we split. I'm involved in DevOps Days events, and a lot of those cover a lot of the issues like we've talked about for the last 30 minutes. So I highly recommend you go to one of those in your city or nearby. They happen all the time. So thank you so much for coming, guys. I really appreciate it.